Well, thank you so much. I don't think I should speak. I already got the standing ovation. I'm just going to leave right now. Let's give it up for Kim and your leadership. Thank you so much. And thank you for that fabulous introduction. It is so good to be back here. I have the distinct honor of representing the 7th Congressional District. Everyone says that they represent the best district, but I'm just saying I really do represent the best district. And Denny Heck and others can fight with me on that. But to the Blue-Green Alliance, let me say that what you're doing, uniting labor, environment, responsible business, and community organizations is absolutely essential. Because we know that it really is within those intersections and with the voices of frontline communities that we are going to find our most effective solutions and harness the most power to actually be able to take on the polluters and climate deniers. For those of you from other states, welcome to the great state of Washington. We are really proud of the work that we do, and I want to give a huge shout out because even as labor unions are being attacked across the country, we are proud in Washington State to have one of the strongest labor unions in the country. Jeff Johnson, thank you for your leadership. And let's not forget, the labor movement is the reason that we have the highest minimum wage in the country tied to inflation. So thank you. And also on addressing climate change, we obviously have a governor who I'm proud to be speaking right before he does, but a governor whose top passion is the environment and has been a climate champion in securing millions for clean energy and prioritizing our clean air and clean water. And I also want to thank the various coalitions in Washington State, labor allies, community allies, folks from the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy and others who have really been doing the hard work of figuring out how we come together on some very, very difficult issues, because it is really important that we ensure that we don't have false choices or false equivalencies, whether it's on the moral front in Charlottesville or whether it is right here in talking about jobs versus the environment. That is just not the right framing, and it is really important that we all push back on that. So thank you for doing that. You can clap for that. Now, in my experience as a woman, an immigrant, an organizer, because that's been my background, I'm a community organizer, have been and will continue to be in the United States House of Representatives, the only woman of color in the state Senate when I was there, and now the first Indian American woman in the U.S. House, and the first person of color in the Washington Democratic delegation to the United States Congress. And it's because of that that I deeply and personally understand the politics of division and the remedies of the politics of intersectionality. I like to say that I'm not a woman on Monday, an immigrant on Tuesday, a worker on Wednesday, and a mom on Thursday. I'm all of those things all of the time, and I'm going to fight for all of those things all of the time. My experience is that the most formidable movements are created when we join forces and build our power together, recognizing that hierarchies of oppression never benefit us, recognizing that some groups and communities are disproportionately burdened and need more help just to get to the same starting point, and recognizing that it is often more complex to build coalitions and find solutions that work for everyone, but the surest fire way to lose is to try to go it alone. So in the wake of 9/11, when I founded the immigrant advocacy organization Hate Free Zone, now called One America, we began with the goal of fighting hate crimes and civil liberties abuses against Arabs, Muslims, and Sikhs in a post-9/11 world, and perpetrated by the Bush administration, most powerful government in the world. And we built our power through organizing and coalition building, but it was not easy. And after 9/11, I can tell you that I could hardly find any elected officials who wanted to visit a mosque or stand up for Muslims. But through building labor, diverse community, and faith coalitions, we were able to grow our power and move the collective conversation in the direction it needed to go. Leading the largest voter registration drive in the history of the state, registering 23,000 new American citizens to vote, suing the Bush administration around deportations and winning, and fighting for comprehensive immigration reform, and instituting some of the best darn policy in the country around immigrants and refugees right here in Washington State. But we also realized that that wasn't enough, that we needed to speak out not only on what was seen as immigrant rights issues, but on immigrant rights issues like collective bargaining rights in the workplace, to work with our labor brothers and sisters on wages and paid safe and sick days, because immigrants are workers. And that's why I'm proud to have been on the committee that passed the $15 minimum wage in Seattle. And I think my first bill that I introduced in the state Senate was the raise the wage bill. We didn't get it in the state Senate, but we got much better at the ballot. So thank you, Washington, all the people that worked to make sure we got a higher minimum wage and paid safe and sick days there. And we did the same thing on marriage equality, recognizing our immigrant LGBTQ leaders and their wisdom. And we've made great strides because of people in this room on preserving our planet and addressing climate change, which is, again, as I said, it's very difficult. And none of this work happens overnight, and it's not always easy. And I'll be honest and say that it has taken dedicated work, time, deep dialogue, collaborative strategy sessions, and evaluation to get to the point that we're at today. Strong leaders in communities of color had to stand up and demand to be at the table in crafting solutions, pointing out over and over again how communities of color are disproportionately burdened by the effects of climate change. Strong leaders in the environmental community had to stand up and show others in the movement why we needed to broaden the decision-making table. And strong leaders in the labor community had to demand that we don't just say the words just transition, but that we actually invest the dollars and the time to make sure that the jobs we create in this clean energy economy are strong, good, union jobs in the places where we're losing some of those jobs. That is not going to be easy. And for each of these leaders, we can clap. Just be loud and let us have our stuff. For each of the leaders, there was a real risk. There is a real risk. And I know because I've had to do it in the immigrant rights movement, of alienating our own bases, because not always are our bases with us on these questions. And so standing up because it's the right thing to do, but also because we know that it is the only way to really build strong and lasting power that can take on the great forces that we have to take on. So you all are here today because you understand better than so many that the intersectionality of the fights we take on is actually what makes those fights worthwhile. And you know that for any one of us to succeed, we have to fight for all of us. The Blue-Green Alliance embodies the very essence of these values in action. From your work in states across the country, working towards a just transition from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy, to your participation on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Alliance is leading the way. You also understand better than anyone else that choosing whether or not we want to commit to a renewable clean energy economy is not really a choice. It is the only option. We all understand that for our communities to thrive, we have to create jobs that are good for workers, good for communities, and good for the environment. And I am doing everything I can in Congress to use that platform to build the movement. It has been horrifying, to say the least, to watch the climate deniers and the biggest corporate polluters taking over our country. We will fight the proposed 30% cut to the EPA just as hard as we fight all the attacks on collective bargaining. And by the way, instead of calling it the EPA, I really think we should call it the Agency for Human Health, Clean Air, and Clean Water, because we need to make it tangible to people. But one of the hardest things that we have been fighting are the administrative changes that are being made in rolling back regulations from the Obama administration and stopping science from coming out through threats and intimidation. And just one example is particularly relevant in the wake of Hurricane Harvey and Irma, and that is the rollback of the Obama-era regulations around considering flooding and sea level rise when building infrastructure. It is an insult that that regulation was rolled back, and now that we have seen in Texas and Florida the devastation of those hurricanes. But in addition to being an opposition party, and those of you who know me know that I'm always at the front of a fight, I'm ready to take on as the opposition party, I also believe we have to be a proposition party, right? We have to propose our vision of what the world looks like, and then we have to be willing to fight for it and call people into that fight. And that's why I'm so proud to be one of the original 4 co-sponsors in the House of the 100 by 50 bill that Senator Jeff Merkley has led in the Senate. We just had a wonderful conversation with him. This is not theoretical. We can do this. We can get to 100% renewable energy by 2050, but we have to do it right. And the bill lays out that path with investments in good jobs in communities of color, in rebuilding a green infrastructure and electrifying the grid. And we all know, because I just went and saw this wonderful demonstration here by the IBEW, that there are more jobs in solar than there are in coal, and Trump voters in coal country, according to polls, do not want dirty coal jobs. What they want is good union jobs in their place of residence. And that's what we have to work for. And I'm also proud to have created with my colleagues Don McEachin of Virginia and Nanette Barragan of California, new members, the United for Climate and Environmental Justice Task Force to lift up environmental justice and communities of color and low-income communities who are suffering across the country but must be the center of climate change efforts. And we've introduced legislation and policy that codifies the Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA and in the Oval Office, the very things that Scott Pruitt is decimating. And we're proposing grant funding to transition all public transportation to zero emissions while keeping costs low, incentivizing the installation of solar panels for low-income families and community solar projects, and doing it together with workers, unions, grassroots leaders, tribes, nonprofits, and government leaders. I want us to be sober, though, and take a moment, determined and clear-eyed about what we're really discussing here. Climate change that is induced by humans exists because someone is making a profit by borrowing from the longer term to serve their shorter term. Many corporations that benefit today, without regard for the downstream climate effects of their actions, are not inclined to modify their practices. Now, there are some enlightened folks and corporations who do get it or are beginning to understand, but there are still many who obstruct progress, and they are being represented very well in Congress by fierce climate deniers and by lobbyists whose very livelihoods depend on keeping people from acknowledging the real threats and challenges before us. And it is a great sign that we have labor, environment, and community advocates coming together, but to build the movement that will propel our legislation to become the law of the land, we have to bind ourselves together by our methods even more than by the content of our proposals. Environmentalist Naomi Klein, who's a good friend, and I discussed this movement building when I was interviewing her for her new book in DC. She calls confronting climate change our great opportunity to rebuild. She proclaims, and these are her words, our economic model is at war with life on Earth. We are not just tackling climate change as if that weren't big enough. We are recalibrating how we interact, distribute resources and costs, and most importantly, how we decide who makes these redistributive decisions. Is it the private sector, increasingly dominated by fewer and fewer super large corporations based on profit motivations? Or is it governance by the will of those who will bear the costs? And if it is the latter, then we will have invented and invested in a new model for ourselves along the way. Brothers and sisters, we have to embrace and be willing to fight for what one of my heroes, Mahatma Gandhi, termed satyagraha. Satyagraha is the principle of the insistence on truth. We must bind ourselves to one simple principle, that we're all better off when we're all better off. And we must remember that we are strongest as a society when we reject fear and scarcity and we embrace generosity and abundance. It is the power of love, love that is focused, determined, positive, and yet willing to take risk when necessary, that will win every time. We will need to call people in as much as we call people out. That means finding a place where we can agree, some human values that bind us together, and then educating each other on what we disagree on. And we need to give place for people to change and grow, including ourselves. And yes, when we need to, we will call people out, including for racism and sexism. So Representative John Young, this lady knows a damn thing about what she's talking about. And by the way, it didn't get much attention, but what I was opposing him on was predatory hunting practices on federal parks lands. And I was saying that that's not a states' rights issue. They are federal lands and therefore subject to federal regulation. So it was about the environment and preserving our parks. Our movement is strong, but we have to build even more strength, and we have to involve people around the country in every community and bring street heat to the fight. Because if politics is the art of the possible, then our job as organizers, whether in Congress or in the streets, is to expand the boundaries of what is seen as possible and to allow space for people in Congress, people in business, people in our communities to do the right thing. And we have to create space for everyone to own that challenge as their own. That means we don't just go to people when we want them to say something or do something, but we actually show up for those fights, like the fight for Dreamers right now, 800,000 young people across this country. And we have to show up and allow space for leadership. So let me end by saying that it does take time, it does not happen overnight. No great movement in the history of this country, whether to end slavery or whether to fight for the right for women to vote, has ever been easy. And if it were easy, it would be done. So brothers and sisters, thank you for everything you've already done. Thank you for everything I know you will do. I will be right there building power with you every step of the way. Thank you so much.